If you've been paying very close attention recently to game releases in Japan, you might have heard of a certain new adventure visual novel game called Eve Ghost Enemies, released on June 30th, 2022 for PS4 and Nintendo Switch. A sequel to a game called Eve Rebirth Terror, released in 2019, which is a sequel to the 1995 classic Eve Burst Terror. Now you might be wondering, how did this mostly Japan-only series produce so many sequels, ports, and more? Well, it all started in 1994. Crisis was brewing in Seizeware, a subsidiary of Himeya Soft and Arrowgate Company, who made such classics like, I don't really know. A man named Hiroyuki Kano was making some ambitious, higher-budget adventure games, or as the idiots over at the visual novel database likes to call them, ADV visual novels. 1994's Desire and Zenith were two of those bigger projects, and let's just say that Himeya Soft management didn't really want those games to be made anymore due to a certain quota not being met as much as they wanted. I'd like to correct myself on my last video because yes, maybe Himeya really did want those games to be made, but they really wanted that quota to be met. So to combat this problem, Kano was put on a different project that would be more traditional to the company's policies. That project would be Amy's Fantasies. Now before I start, I had to say that this game is truly bizarre. It includes such things as an unreliable and perverted narrator, a protagonist with a suspicious amount of lust for her younger, non-related brother, and a constantly role-switching cast of characters. If that didn't sound weird, just play the game. Don't Call Me Emmy was released in 1995 for the PC-98, and later that year got a CD-ROM re-release for the same system along with the FM Towns. That included voice acting, and in 1996 a Windows 95 port, which was about the same as the CD-ROM version, but with text on screen instead of only being voice acting. Also in 1996, this game was the first ever Himeya Soft game to ever be released outside of Asian countries and into the English-speaking world, and later on an inferior port to web browsers by fans. Look, SM Project was a pretty good idea, being able to play visual novels in your web browser, and a good site in general, but they really fucked up on a few things, and they will probably never fix them, because the site has been dead for decades at this point. No, just one decade. Anyways, the whole plot of this game is that on Amy's 18th birthday, she plans to have a good party with her brother, but sadly a debt collector comes over to take all of her dead father's possessions, which happens to include Emmy's brother Tomoki. So Emmy decides to go on a quest to find her missing brother with the power of large hair and an identity crisis. And speaking of large hair, wow, this game's art design is very different from the more serious, gritty looking designs of earlier Seizeware titles. Emmy probably has more strands of hair than brain cells in her head full of air. Also, the backgrounds are still very well done. Many of them are full of small details like this one with the school student who I think is about to fall to his death. And there are also a few other ones that could be perfect for a desktop wallpaper if you're into that sort of thing. It just takes you into the more lighthearted aesthetics of this game. Also, it's pretty short. You can probably finish it in about 3 hours at a leisurely pace, obviously not counting the high amount of sweet breaks you might want to take. Anyways, this game has a very interesting way of doing the story. The amount of characters, as you can see here, is very small compared to earlier Seizeware titles and the ones that succeeded it. However, it gets around that problem. There are 3 stories. The first one sets up the story and some of the characters, and the second one takes place in a hospital where Emmy finds Tomoki. I don't know, he dies immediately. And finally, the third story takes place in a large mansion where our main character must take on a different, more bizarre personality to be a maid and find her brother finally, plus the story ends with a mansion burning to a crisp. I think I'm getting deja vu here. Anyways, at the end of every story, the main characters break the fourth wall and tell you who they will be playing in the next story. For example, Tomoki may be playing, Tomoki in the first story, but in the second story, he'll be playing someone completely different. It's a fun way and adds to the stupidity and hilarity of the whole game. Also, the voice acting is amazing. It's nice to hear all the dumb voices that Emmy makes at points, or maybe it's just bad. I, of course, wouldn't, just never know. Now, I have a couple problems with the game. Like I said earlier, the SM Projekt version to the web is just not good. It's missing a ton of stuff like the multiple versions of the soundtrack, and only having the Windows version, which is perfectly fine, but it isn't as good as the OPNA or maybe the OPN version. The voice acting is completely missing, which is a major problem, because if you want to have the full experience and humor, you shouldn't be playing this version. I would recommend the 1996 Windows port or the Japanese PC 9821 FM Town CD release, which both include voice acting, good music, and can run on modern Windows if you have an emulator or a patched version found on archive.org. I do recommend this game if you're semi-interested in the new Kige side of Ware, because it's literally the only good new Kige to come out of the company that's in English, and can be finished in half an afternoon. And now on to Ware's most famous game, Eve Burst Error. But why is this Ware's most famous and successful game? Most simple. It came out on the PC 98 in 1995, got a censored Sega Saturn port in 1997, a Windows port based on the Sega Saturn port in the same year, which was later localized into English in 2000, got a PS2 port in 2003, a remake of the game for Windows that had uncensored content and improved the graphics, and also included the original PC 98 version in the files. It got a sequel on consoles in 1998, got another sequel in 1999, which I will talk about later, got a prequel in 2000, got another sequel based on the sequel in 2001, got another sequel in 2006, a mahjong and card game in 2008, another remake in 2010 with updated graphics, and two more remakes, one based on the Sega Saturn port, and another one based off the PC 98 port called RNA respectively. Also, two more sequels in 2019 and 2022. Wow. Isn't that a mountain of shit? Anyways, after Kano finished Amy's Fantasies, he went on freelance, and I think he left Ware at this point. Maybe. This part of the story of the whole Kano stuff is, I don't really understand, because if he left, why did he stay, and why did management allow him to make another high-budget title when they didn't want to pursue it anymore? Whatever, there are a lot of other weird points that I will talk about later. Eve was Kano's last project at the company, and due to being freelance, he got to have a lot more freedom than what he originally had on earlier titles. I have no idea if management was meddling with this game, so Ryu Umimoto also returned as composer along with Ryu Takumi, who also composed for games by Cocktail Soft, Fairy Tale, and Studio Twinkle. And, unsurprisingly, Eve sold very well. It eventually sold over 300,000 copies in Japan across the PC and console versions, and became one of the most influential visual novels ever made. After the game was finished, Kano went to Elf to make more great titles, but I'll talk about that more in detail in... oh shit! Let's go back to Desire for a moment. In that game, you can play as two protagonists in that game, one male, one female, both showing you different perspectives on the story. You can play as one character for the entire run, and then run through the other when you're done. But in Eve, this concept is taken a bit of a step further. You play as two protagonists, Kojiroh and Marina, both showing you different perspectives on the story, with their own side plots that tie into the main story. However, to progress at points in the story, you must swap to the other protagonists to see what they're doing, and then go back to the other protagonist to do the same thing. At one point, you have to swap back and forth in a sequence that can be annoying and nonsensical if you have zero idea what you're doing. Basically, the gameplay is the same as earlier Ware titles. However, instead of being trapped in one area for an entire game like a house or a school, the entire world is pretty much more open. Some things you need to do can be done in an out-of-order way. For example, if you need to see an event at the school, you have to go to see people at the hotel, bar, office, etc. And those events can be done in any order. However, this can bring up a bit of an issue. It can be annoying at points to find out where the hell to go because of how open the game is, and on top of that, The two protagonists can have the same area of where they can go, but the paths to get to those places can be a bit different. And some areas can be locked to one protagonist only for some time until they need to go there. I, of course, use a guide, so it really wasn't much of an issue, but at points you can find yourself getting lost and having to backtrack a few steps to figure out what you missed. See where games like this are labeled as hard visual novels sometimes by fans due to not being an enter or mouse one click to progress the story for 60 hours like normal visual novels. And it doesn't stop at the Windows version. I've heard horror stories of the original PC98 version due to being absolutely miserable to go through due to the obtuseness of the menu system and openness. Saving doesn't actually save your actual point or location, but instead puts you at a checkpoint at the beginning of an event, which is kinda okay, but if you're in a rush, it can be a little annoying to go through a couple of lines when you load your save file. I didn't really have an issue with it because when I was done with the game for the night, I made sure to go to a place without an event there at the point in the game and save there. But this save system will cause you a couple of awful problems, which I will talk about later. Also, the game is much longer than Love Potion, Fatal Relations, or Amy's Fantasies, all combined. It's around 25 hours long and is an actual story instead of being bad new Kige. As I said before, you play as two protagonists. The first is Kojiroh, a private detective who's a total pervert and possibly a schizophrenic. He was once working at the Katsuragi detective offices until a certain incident occurred, an event that was later explained in pointless amount of detail in the game's prequel, and he left to make his own detective offices in a rundown warehouse district. Oh yeah, he's very poor because of course he gets no cases. Obviously, no one is going to go to a warehouse to find a detective to solve a case instead of the actual city. So he goes 3 months without a case until a green-haired tomboy named Kanomi decides to come in with one. This fat, rich man apparently lost a very expensive painting. Perfect. To make matters worse, the place he used to work with is also on that case, which includes a person running it being his ex, then not ex, then ex again. And the man who's working on the case there, Nikaido, is a short-tempered ass that Kojiroh loves to mess with and call names like Necrophilio, Fido, etc. Of course, that's not the full half of the game. I'm not going to go into spoilers for reasons. All that happens on the first day is collecting information from people and introducing the cast of characters. There's this one bit that goes on for the full first day where this boy is hanging around in Kojiroh's office. At the end, he's attacked by more idiotic children, and you even get to listen in on what the kid sounds like. Yeah, if it wasn't obvious already, this is not a male. It's the exact opposite, and is just played for jokes. He keeps going on and on, even when Kojiroh gets quite up close. The gag runs on until she goes to take a bath, and you get this scene. The game is rated M for mature, by the way, so YouTube's whole takedown system can go fuck itself. Anyways, her name is Puddin. Yes, that is her actual name. Kinda, but no spoilers. She may seem like a simple character that's just there to give a bit of humor to the player and such, but she's actually very major. Kojiroh's dialogue is full of innuendos. It's pretty hard to go without one scene of him mentioning something inappropriate. After the whole painting arc is done, which takes about a day in-game, everything goes to shit immediately. However, I'm not spoiling. Play the fucking game. The second protagonist is Marina Hojo, a chaotic female detective with a very high but not perfect success rate, and terrible luck with men. And not surprisingly, she's just as perverted as Kojiroh. She just came back from the US after doing some stuff with the president. What she does for about half of her scenario is being a bodyguard. And since the body she needs to guard is female, Marina is basically bisexual in the body she needs to guard is the daughter of a representative of an obviously fictional Middle Eastern country called Eldia. Chaos ensues. I found this scenario to be a bit more fun because I found those out-of-order segments to be a lot more or less frequent and apparent compared to Kojiroh's scenario. The scenario is tense from the beginning. No fetch quest to get a painting, straight to assassination prevention. Marina's body that she needs to guard, Maikayo Mido, gets a lot of character development and screen time with Marina. Marina likes to mess with her a bit, and at points she does like to cheer her up, which she kinda has to be doing that. At one point early on, Mido says that she doesn't need a bodyguard even though kidnapping and assassination attempts get thrown at her at that portion of the game. Man, she's stupid. The two grow a lot of chemistry, and I always ask myself, will things go sour? Will they do it? Well, the answer is yes. Sadly, not in the Windows version. Of course, the fun times end, and same with Kojiroh's scenario, everything goes to shit immediately. No spoilers, play the fucking game. Now, the localized Windows version was censored. It wasn't because of any localization changes, it was just already there from the Sega Saturn port, which obviously had to change a couple of things. It's clear Ware was perfectly fine with having their localized games uncensored, unlike an earlier company who did the exact same fucking thing. The censorship was fine to me because I played the game for the story and the music, and as some projects, the website I played the game on actually allows you to see the uncensored and much better PC98 versions of the images. Now personally, I prefer the images from the Sega Saturn version at points. Actually, I lied about that. The script is about 10 months old at this point. Now, I played with the Sega Saturn version at the beginning, but I decided to switch back because of morals. Now, I gotta say, the censorship really benefits the game. It's a good detective game, and when the adult content is ripped out, you get to focus 100% on the mystery, and there's sometimes funny dialogue. The music is, of course, really good, and gives out a really great vibe in the more upbeat tracks. Now at this point from the game by the composers behind Ware, the OPN chip was starting to show its age. The YM2203 is very limited, and I don't think Takumi or Umimoto had the chip mainly in mind when making the music. Instead, the YM2608 versions are the best, and are probably the versions they originally worked for, and then later watered down it so to work on the YM2203 for those who didn't already have a OPNA sound card at this point. This type of watering down would be blatantly obvious in Umimoto and Takumi's later game, which I'll go into more in depth later. The gameplay is practically unchanged from previous titles, but it was already a decent system. I, of course, recommend using a guide if you plan on playing the game. Trust me, you will get lost if you don't use the guide. The translation isn't perfect. I noticed a few misspellings at points, which are minor, but it's there. Of course, they had to change the jokes around, or else players would be quite confused at all the Japanese jokes that no one really knows in the West, unless you're fucking 90s weeb, I guess. So what kind of jokes did they actually include? Well, Bill Clinton jokes, and more inappropriate adult jokes. And it doesn't stop at Bill Clinton, they also have jokes about O.J. Simpson and the Titanic movie. Hey, I thought this game was supposed to be in 1995 Japan, not 2000s America. Desire's translation also wasn't perfect, but at least it was really fucking funny. I heard in it there was an adult scene that was written only in rhymes in the game. Thankfully, I don't think there's any Bill Clinton jokes in there, or maybe it's not documented, but it's extremely documented in Eve. Not so much in Desire, no one fucking plays that game. Also, there's some inconsistencies. For example, the voice actors speak Japanese, and the game takes place somewhere in Japan, but at one point Kojiroh says to someone, "Do you know English?" even though clearly no one is speaking English. Eve is actually a sequel to Love Potion, and includes a few characters like Matsuno and Kyuko. There are a lot of references to Love Potion like Kyuko, being assigned to work at the Eldian school because the director Ko was apparently embezzling money. Also, at points you have to walk around aimlessly just to progress at a very late point in both scenarios, where you have to go through everywhere on a ship just to progress. Now you might be asking, what's the big deal with the hacking sequence? Well, the hacking sequence is literally the only time in the entire game and the entire series which you have to go back and forth to swap between both protagonists to progress. And to progress, I mean, like, you have to do it a lot. It may not seem bad, but with an awful save system, a weird way to go about progressing, and easily losing yourself in the bad kind of way, it's easy to see why people hate this section. It's around 30 minutes long if you know what you're doing, but it can take hours. I used a guide, and I still had no clue how to even do it. It can pull funnies on you, and you have to go through all commands just to have a new command come up. One of the swaps include both protagonists having to send messages to each other with their computers to progress. You have to swap back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth for them to do this. Why? They can also, like, they haven't just gotten the message yet if you click on the wrong command. Are you serious, Marina? Look at the damn screen. Oh, I have to look at the screen. You literally already are. Thankfully, after that's over, you never have to do this anymore in the entire series. The hacking sequence is a cool idea, but with very poor execution due to the other game's mechanics holding it back. I can see why no one wanted it anymore. However, the obtuseness doesn't end there. Very late in the game, as in literally the last thing you do in the game, you have to solve the whole mystery about the murders that occurred throughout the game and figure out who killed who. You go through the cases and uncover clues pointing out to the killers. There is zero evidence pointing to the killers for most of them. I tried to solve it even though the guide I was using would give me the answers if I pressed a button, but no, I spent 3 hours reviewing the cases, taking notes that could be clues, looking at the roster, eliminating ones who definitely wouldn't kill anyone, and what I found was nothing. I couldn't figure it out, most of them. And one of them was kind of obvious if you think about it, but most of them didn't. I re-reviewed the cases with the stuff I now knew, but I still found nothing. The hacking sequence is kind of forgivable because the other mechanics held it back, but this part is definitely not forgivable. The dialogue holds it back, and it could have been easier to figure it out if it wasn't 100% always fooling you into thinking that the killer didn't do anything. Sadly, no clue if this whole case review system ever returned in the many sequels or prequels. Due to Eve's great success in influence, it became a franchise very quickly. Maybe it had a bit too many games, but thankfully there weren't many that came out in the West. But wait, Kano and Umimoto left Rare for good, so this probably isn't a very good sign. Of course, Eve Burst Air got ports to the Saturn and Windows with updated graphics. In 1998, Eve the Lost One was released, which was a direct sequel to the last game, and was released on Saturn, PlayStation, and apparently Windows, but I can't find a dump of it. It wasn't released in the West for some reason. Since it was a console game, there was no adult content. 2 years later, Atom the Double Factor came out on Windows, and was a sequel to Burst Error. Not a sequel to The Lost One, but in a different universe? This becomes extremely confusing. It was later released in the West, but I'll talk about it more later. In 2000, a prequel came out called Eve Zero. And here I asked, why make a prequel? I thought they wrapped up the game pretty good. Yeah, it did have some questions as to what happened and they left it all up for debate, but I thought that the backstory was fleshed out enough to not require more diving into. 2001 saw a sequel to Double Factor called The Fatal Attraction. Also, Double Factor and Fatal Attraction ditched the menu-based navigation and instead opted for a system called the Touchable View, which is basically just a fancy name for a point-and-click adventure system. Sadly, no English version, as I think after Double Factor, Himeya Soft just kinda gave up on their entire Western division and shut down quietly. Anyways, in 2006, another reboot sequel called New Generation came out for the PS2 and later an uncensored Windows port. This one is kinda special because it was written by Kotaro Uchikoshi, who you may know as the writer for popular visual novels like Zero Escape, which includes the very lengthy and somewhat confusingly titled 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, AI Summoning Files, which I heard is pretty good, and the Infinity series, which includes Never 7, Ever 17, and Remember 11, and also 12 Ribbon. And how could I forget? Unknown Eroge game. I did hear that the Infinity series writing being extremely anti-English and is basically truly only good and understandable in its original Japanese language. Oh well. In 2010, Hotibox and Katogawa Shoden released a remake of Burst Air on the PSP called Burst Air, Eve the First, and it was not well received. It changed the art to something more simple and soulless compared to the original, and they changed some of the characters' traits. Like Kyoko, here's the PC98 version of here, containing all my favorite V&D traits and such. Holy shit, she's a child now. Well, there's 2 counts of changing characters' appearances to look like children for the PSP remix, the first being Star Ocean's Second Evolution. What the fuck happened, Squeenix? Other character designs look awful. Where's my PC98 soul? Now it just looks like any generic 2010s anime. Jesus Christ. Also, they completely changed the voice acting cast. In the sequels and prequels before and after this game, the voice cast always stayed the same with a few changes at points. I did find a GameFAQs forum post that rants on and on about the remake, saying that Higurashi has enough serial killer visual novel nonsense than Burst Error, and he also wishes for a remake of Yuno. Look, Mario Master, I think you should be more careful what you wish for. And despite being called Eve the First, they didn't make more Eve remakes, which is probably for the better. However, 6 years later, 2 remasters came out. Eve Burst Error R and A. R for remaster, A for adult. They were made by Eldia, a brand owned by Red Flagship that had their name obviously taken from the fictional Middle Eastern country in the Eve series. They made Chaos Head, and let's trust them with remastering a game that literally made visual novels good. R was just remastering of the Sega Saturn port of the original game for consoles and PC. A was a remaster of the PC98 version and was only released for PC because of reasons. The new artwork for these remasters are very faithful to the original and just look like the originals but with a new coat of paint, which I would say is the best way to go about remastering games like this, which are pretty old, unlike a certain remake made by 5PB. I found another rant by Mario Master on GameFAQs complaining even more about the remakes, but I think this one was made before A was released or announced. And after that, Eldia remastered Desire in the same way as Eve Burst Error R, which is pretty cool. I like that idea of remastering old classics like this in both their censored ways to appeal to the younger set of people, or just people who don't want to see the adult content, and the uncensored version for everyone else. My only problems is not having any sort of way to see the original gritty, adult, and amazing style of the original PC98 pixel art. Only able to hear the new remixes and not the old FM versions, though that's probably patchable. And not being in English, which is a major problem. No LD game has made it to the West, sadly. But besides that, I do hope they remaster Zenith or maybe even Love Potion because Kano. And of course, LD had to make their own string of sequels to the original. Rebirth Terror came out in 2019 for consoles only, and Ghost Enemies came out in 2022, also for consoles. No English version, sadly. I mean, maybe. Neither the Eve or Desire remasters have been released in English, so don't get your hopes up. But anyways, I did hear that these 2 sequels are actually a very well done homage to the original Eve and also Desire, while doing new stuff with the old set of characters. Overall, Eve Burst Air is great, but it has a few flaws. If you can deal with the obtuse sections and an absurd amount of cheesy adult dialogue, I highly recommend it. Due to all of those remakes, remasters, and whatnot, there is no perfect version for English players, and the best you can find is on the Essen Project on your web browser. Like I said earlier, in 1999, a sequel to Eve came out called Adam the Double Factor. It was released in English in 2003, and it was the last Himeya Soft game to be released outside of Japan. Heck, even back then, English players knew that this was the end of the line for these types of games because the sequel to Double Factor, Fatal Attraction, was said to be unlikely to be translated. And it of course never was. Sadly, the translation is even worse for this game. Blatant spelling errors all over and boring dialogue just plagues this game. And it does have a neat new spin on the gameplay. Instead of navigating through a menu, you point and click. Sadly, I didn't really enjoy this change. At points you have to be so specific on where you place your mouse cursor to progress, which can be super annoying after a while. There are zero indicators for anything, and the ways to go to places are completely out of whack compared to the original. For example, the bar used to be in a hotel in the original game, so you have to go through there before you can enter the bar. However, in Double Factor, it's just in the middle of a sidewalk, so I just spent 30 minutes trying to figure out where to go to the next place and go to this bar. It was just there looking at it as part of the background. I know this sounds like nitpicking, and it is, but I would rather have everything laid out on a menu instead of having to just look at a generic looking background with no clues on what you can press and where you can go to. But there are some good things that this game adds, such like a text backlog, a feature that is used in multiple visual novels like NVL versions, like Higurashi, Fate Stay Night, Tsukihime 999, everything you can think of, it has a text backlog. And a map screen, so no more annoying find out where to go to the correct place. Instead, you could just look at this map and find out which correct place you need to go to, and you find out pretty much very easily new places to go to. Plus, the music is pretty good and has a nice vibe going. It also turns out the composer has also done music for a few 90s Sonic games, as well as a lot of Seizure stuff. I don't really have much to say about this game other than I wouldn't recommend it at all unless you're a massive Eve fan, which I know none of you who are watching this video is. Besides making Double Factor and a million other Eve sequels, Himeya Soft and Seizure did make a few other games before and after Kano. In 1994, a cyberpunk CD-ROM was made by Himeya Soft called Phobos, which, according to IGN's Koji Fukuyama, it's the cyberpunk version of Eve Burstair due to its very comedic style with the Snatcher-like contents. And also, he said that the ending of the game, Last of Us, was very similar to the ending in this game. God, do I love mistranslations. Plus the music is great and the artwork is quite good. If you've never heard of the Viper series of games, they're quite interesting games, made by Sagna that didn't use still images but instead fully animated their adventure games and also had voice acting if you bought a patch, or if it was already in the game like in the later versions. Now, due to this, the game came on an absurd amount of floppy disks, as many as 40 in Viper CTR, the final title in the series on PC 98. And the games were just straight adventure games with very few choices. The only other games that Sagna made were just called Animajan, which was of course a Mahjong game with very fluid cutscenes. And of course Sagna had a few imitators like Himeya Soft, who made two games with the same type of style. Zenith, released in 1994, and De.FaNa, released in 1995. Both were under the full animation AVG series, which obviously just became a duology and nothing else, and were just a carbon copy of Sagna's style, with some Himeya Soft flair. They're short, and they're somewhat fluidly animated, but not to the extent Sagna would be with Viper CTR in 1997 with its 40 fucking floppy disks. And the art isn't as flashy as games like Phobos or Eve. It has a desaturated color palette, which I know is what they're trying to go for with the whole anime OVA type look, but it's on your PC. but I'll probably prefer the more detailed looks of the other games. But hey, as always, the music is pretty good. Okay, now in April 1996 came GLORIA, a sequel but not sequel to Fatal Relations. It has the same concepts as Fatal Relations, like being trapped in a mansion for literally almost the entire game, having an entire female cast either being maids or part of the family, or heck, maybe even both, and being a wicked short time span for your playthrough. Heck, a playthrough of this game can be shorter than Fatal Relations. However, there's a catch. Maybe too many catches. For one, this game is actually good. You play as Kira, a Japanese MIT student who is hired to be a tutor for the extremely rich GLORIA family, so they can decide who will be the next in line for the head of the family. Okay, right off the bat, they are riffing off a game made by Silkies, aka Elf, called Kazurasaki Ki no Ichikosu, released in 1993, which follows the same setup, and also other stuff. And here's the best thing, this game actually takes place in America, so this game can get away with as many Clinton jokes or dumb 90s references as it pleases. Speaking of certain games made by Silkies, GLORIA has a different way of doing the adventure game style menus. Instead of bashing through menus full of move, talk, look, whatever, instead, here's your first option in the game. You choose the bottom option and the game just ends. Same goes with the next option. You choose the bottom option, you don't get the job, and the game ends right there. And the game isn't just full of those crappy, you choose one wrong option and you're dead. No, this game has 48 endings. Some with the same ending, some with radically different ones, and one where the protagonist dies, our protagonist is marries, death, death, and more death. There's a lot of death in these games, Jesus Christ. Anyways, the cast. Instead of being related by blood, mostly, a lot of the GLORIA family are adopted. And the cast is a lot more diverse in this game. For example, Charmy is Arabic, Naomi is Japanese, Cicely is Italian, Lisa is Russian, and Georg is a womanizer. Very diverse, very diverse, very diverse. So back to the plot and divergent choices. You are allowed to choose who you can tutor to help out to be the next head of the GLORIA family. You can only choose one girl out of all 5. And George, another tutor who came to the same building, he can also choose who he wants to tutor, but he just always chooses Etna, so she's completely out of your picture. And she never has an ending where she gets the best out of everyone to be the head of the family. She's never the head of the family. So you're down to 4. You can choose Charmy, the youngest of the family, marry the immature, naive, ignorant nuisance, who's probably my least favorite character of the entire game, Naomi, the cynical, lazy, sadist Japanese girl who drinks all day long. And she's 16, by the way. Very illegal, very illegal. And Cicely, the shy maid who's doing maid stuff because she's bad at school. And of course there's Etna, who's the oldest, strict, selfish, and kinda deserves to drown and not be the next heir. Heck, George has his own endings where he becomes next in line, much more than Etna. The endings are divided into a few categories. There's the alone endings where the protagonist doesn't end up in any relationships, which includes about 40% of the endings, kinda like real life. Of course, the endings where the protagonist ends up with any of the GLORIA family except Etna because fuck her and no Lisa. Also, I think the only reason Lisa exists is so that there can be more adult CGs in the game because she really has no significance to the plot. Anyways, there are a few endings like the joke endings, one where the game literally tells you to go fuck yourself and play more seriously, so good luck seeing all 49 endings. I didn't. I just went through a few of the major ones until the game decided to give me all of the extras. Oh yeah, the extra games. There are 3 of them. Love Love Charmy, Naomi's Room, and Fatal Game. Love Love Charmy is basically just an epilogue type deal to one of Charmy's endings, where Kira and Charmy get it on after they've been married. Naomi introduces the cast of characters from Naomi's humorous point of view, and Fatal Game is just a gambling game. Also, the music is very good, yet not as long as I would have liked. I would have enjoyed a few more tracks and the graphics. Oh man, the graphics. Look at these backgrounds. They are a lot more clear and a major step up from Eve's art. They're not Uno good or Star Platinum good, but they're definitely competing with some of the best looking art from the system in 1996, and probably this one with Charmy and her lizard is probably the best pieces of art to come out of the system in general. Overall, GLORIA is a decent game. It's on SM Project, so if you want to play it for an hour to see an ending and experience some of the game's content, have that. I don't think it's worth going for 100% and playing every ending the game has in store for you, but you be you. Remember like 20 minutes ago when I said that Eve was the most popular game Himeya Soft ever made? Somehow I was lying about that. In 1998, Sequels would release DIVI-DEAD, a mystery horror adventure game. It got a translation to English the same year, and that was it until 2003, where it got a Spanish translation by fans. Then in 2005, a Portuguese patch, and then finally in 2008, someone ported the game to Flash 9, Dreamcast, PlayStation Portable, and Xbox. Basically, all the major homebrew systems at the time had this game ported onto them. Why? I don't know. But hey, if you want to play porn games on your hacked PSP wherever you go on. Also, later on there were patches for those versions that fixed up the game, like translating the map. I'll talk more about that later, but this amount of porn made the game somewhat popular. Right now, the game is ranked 294th most popular visual novel on VNDB. Eve Burst Error is ranked 470th. Despite the popularity difference, it seems that DIVI-DEAD popularity was just made because it was on multiple different homebrew systems, and they still happen to be somewhat popular to this very day, and people who enjoyed both erotic Japanese games and homebrew video game consoles just found this game and decided to play it. In the recent ratings of this game from VNDB, this game is mildly popular, yet very much average. It's like those more recent visual novels like Ecchi Sensei and Lessons in Love. Those games are somewhat famous for being extremely long visual novels with long scripts and racking hundreds of dollars a month from Ecchi Sensei's case to just be the longest visual novel ever made by releasing content weeks at a time instead of working to a release date. Hell, these games have no end in sight, unlike other long VNs like the When They Cry series, which are episodic, and they planned the whole thing day one. No end in sight was planned for those games. These games are long because, hey, why don't we make a shitty romance visual novel and have it be 500 hours long? Why not? Why not? There's no reason for it. And the Lessons in Love creators most likely fake reviews for VNDB, and 90% of their itch.io comments were probably made by the creators just to overhype the game. They are generic, overrated, Ren'P bullshit made by English weebs who just wanted to make the next One Piece or something in visual novel form. I'll probably talk more about Lessons in Love when I feel about ranting, because now is not the time. Anyways, DIVI-DEAD kinda sucks. The translation is awful, it's quite stiff, and there's some shitty pop culture references in there. And there's some map movement in the game, like adding the double factor. However, the locations have a lot of issues. As in a lot, I mean just one, but it's pretty major. It's navigatable, but the location names are in Japanese. They didn't translate the menus. Also, known as in the main fucking way to move around in the game. The guide I used had all the locations in English, like go to the shed. Bro, I don't even know where the fucking shed is, smartass. I can't read jack shit. If the localizers were too lazy to translate the absolute most important mode of progressing in the game, why bother? Some say it adds to the challenge of progressing in the game and makes it fun, but I'd rather call it a waste of time to go to all of the places in the game to find the one place I need to go to, then spend 5 more hours finding the next person. It's like Desire in Eve Burster amount of annoying brute force menus, but on crack. So don't bother with this game, but it's on everything, so if you want to play an adult visual novel on your Dreamcast, this is literally your only choice. So have your Stockholm Syndrome ready. While it's not an adventure game or a visual novel, I should mention that Himeya Soft made an interesting puzzle game called Kotobuki in 1997. It's like a fan disc type game with stages based on many earlier Sequels titles like Fatal Relations, Love Potion, Desire, Zenith, Amy's Fantasies, Eve Burster, and GLORIA. Basically, all the characters from the games are done starring in shitty adult games, so they go to a world where they never have to star in any of those games ever again. But Sequels decides to take revenge, and the new protagonist never seen in any other game made by the company or since, Pino and Pao, attempt to stop them and have them to return to their adult doings. Basically, this game is a puzzle game with billiards balls. You set them down and try to build a sequence to kill enemies. It's fun and the gameplay is very bizarre and different. I have never seen any game since or before do anything really close to it. The music is great as well, having some remixes of music from earlier games. Plus, the game is short, so check it out. And that's it for Sequels games that were released in English. Overall, not the best catalog, but there were some obviously great games that they made. In Japan, there was also a third Fatal Relations game and some other bizarre games, but they don't look great, but hey, who knows. And that about wraps up the video. Next video, I'll be talking about Elf and their games and Kano and what happened next in Kano.